Mir jetzt zugeschaltet von der amerikanischen Westküste ist Alex Epstein, Bestsellerautor, New York Times Bestsellerautor, eine der interessantesten Stimmen weltweit über das Thema Energiepolitik und fossile Energien. Alex, thanks for being on the program.
My pleasure.
So, Alex, the German government keeps telling us that the whole world admires us for our energy policy here in Germany, that we got out of nuclear energy and that we are a role model for the whole world, that everyone will follow the German so-called Energiewende, so the change to renewable energies. Please tell us, is that true? Is the whole world admiring German energy policy?
I'm interested. Just one clarifying question: are they still saying that? Because I can see them saying it sort of pre-Russia invasion of Ukraine, but you would think there might be a little humility after that kind of desperation.
No
No.
humility, no humility. They have doubled down on it. You know, we've abandoned nuclear, and they're still saying Germany will be the role model for a global energy policy without fossil fuels, and everyone is admiring us. Everyone is following us.
Um, yeah, my experience of this is quite different. So I think maybe 2012 was maybe that you start to have the peak admiration of Germany. I remember I was debating a very prominent American named Bill McKibben, who's arguably the leader of the really the global anti-fossil fuel movement. And he would just say, it's amazing in Germany. Germany's doing so great. But then you start to see the data coming out and you start to see, wait, they're paying way, way more for electricity than we are in the United States. And you keep hearing, well, it's going to get cheaper. It's going to get cheaper because the panels are getting cheaper, but then it's not getting cheaper. And and then you start to see all sorts of problems mounting, and then industries are having trouble being in Germany. And then you see, well, I mean, fast forward with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you see Germany is dangerously dependent on natural gas because it thought it didn't need natural gas. And then it realizes, wow, we're dangerously dependent on Russia. Maybe we don't want that. And then it leads this Herculean scramble to try to import some gas, including from the United States. But I think in general, Germany, I always use as a showcase of what not to do at this point, because what you're doing is you're restricting the availability of fossil fuels in the name of reducing CO2 emissions. But at the same time, you oppose nuclear energy, which is the most scalable way we have of getting a lot of energy without a lot of CO2 emissions. And then you're trying to rely on unreliable solar and wind. But since those can go near zero at any given time, you need both an unreliable grid and then a reliable grid to support it. And because Germans tend to want reliability, they've paid a lot for this double grid situation. Although I think they may be moving away from that, but then you get away from reliability, which is what we've had in California, what we've seen in Texas. I'm in California, is where people don't want to pay for the full reliable backup grid. So they play what I call reliability chicken, and they try to get away with shutting down reliable power plants. And then they hope the sun shines enough, the wind blows enough, doesn't get too hot, doesn't get too cold. That doesn't work in California. It sure as hell doesn't work in Germany.
Just a frank question. Wasn't it outright insane to abandon nuclear power here in Germany in the middle of a historic energy crisis?
Well, I mean, I think they had already made the basic decision, right, to do it. And so there was this issue of, well, are we going to have quote unquote integrity with our terrible decision? And I guess they decided yes. But yeah, it's just on the face of it. But it's what's interesting about it from my perspective is it's not just Germany; it's the whole global anti-fossil fuel movement has always been very tightly coupled with a global anti-nuclear movement. And I think ultimately that's not a coincidence. It's also coupled with a pretty widespread anti-hydro movement. So hydro is the other thing that can produce a lot of energy with relatively low CO2. Now, hydro doesn't scale everywhere because you can't build dams everywhere, but it's still a great source of energy. And yet you see this three-part opposition of we're against fossil fuels, but we're against fossil fuels because we claim we care so much about CO2, but we still love energy. But then wait, you're against nuclear, you're against hydro, and my conclusion in my work, and detailed a lot in Fossil Future, is well, actually, you don't really love energy. What you hate impact. You hate human impact on nature. That's why you oppose hydro because it makes an impact. You hate nuclear because it makes a different kind of impact, even though it's a smaller impact. And ultimately, you see opposition to mining and transmission line building and construction, which are the huge impacts involved in solar and wind. So ultimately, we have to choose, is our goal to eliminate human impact from Earth? Because if you want that, then you're ultimately eliminating human life from Earth. And my view is no, we should advance human flourishing on Earth. We should minimize human harming impact, so impacts that actually make our lives worse. But we should embrace impact in general. And I think Germany, of all places, should recognize this because it's a country that's a lot of its historical greatness is industrial, and industrial means having an impact.
So the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said in Dubai at the COP climate conference that fossil fuels are peaking now, that the world is turning away from fossil fuels. You're making, obviously, a whole different case in your great book, Fossil Future. So do you think it's true what the German Chancellor is saying there? Is fossil really peaking and is the whole world moving away from it? Or is that just a propaganda argument?
Well, the number one question is should it be peaking and should it move away from it? And I argue in my book, no, absolutely not. We need to be using more fossil fuels because there's nothing else that can provide energy that's low cost, reliable, can power every type of machine, and can do it for billions of people in thousands of places. And we live in a very energy poor world. I mean, Germany's relatively wealthy, and 6 billion people use an amount of energy that most, at least Americans, Canadians, would consider unacceptable. So the world needs much more energy. Now, will it peak? Well, the dynamics I gave say not only it's immoral, but also it's unlikely that it peaks. What we've seen is even with the opposition to fossil fuels being the literally the leading political cause in the world, it still hasn't peaked. Fossil fuel industry is still growing despite being the most hated, I would argue, politically opposed industry in the world. So you see these people get these predictions wrong. But I would say that the number one thing is that it's the wrong thing to do. It's clearly harmful. We're seeing a lot of regression that we haven't really seen in modern life because of this anti-fossil fuel movement. And I think Germany's been a leading villain here. And it would be great if Germans pressure the government to change course. I think that would be a great signal for the rest of the world.
So you just mentioned wrong predictions, and what always amazes me is how can a movement that got so many things over decades so wrong still have so much political credibility? Just another example here from Germany. So the Green Party mainly said we will turn off nuclear power and we will have clean energy in Germany. And what happened, obviously, is that this country got into a huge energy crisis and they had to return on coal power plants. So by now we have the most polluted energy of all Europe together with Poland. So, they were wrong about everything. But how does this movement still control the political debate in a way that you just described?
Well, let's compound the question because it's not just faulty economic predictions; it's faulty environmental predictions. So we've seen. I talk about in chapter 2 of Fossil Future. We've seen a whole suite of predictions that have come the exact opposite of the truth. So we've seen the prediction that we're going to fossil fuels are going to lead the rapid depletion of resources. We won't have any stuff. The world is more abundant than ever in terms of available resources. We've heard that fossil fuels will make the world unlivably polluted. We've seen the world becoming cleaner and cleaner, both because of reducing pollution from fossil fuels and other industry, but also reducing natural pollution. Mother Nature is the number one polluter, for example, of water. And then with climate, we've seen repeated predictions, whether it's warming or cooling, that we're going to have a mass increase in climate disaster deaths. So people dying from storms and floods and heat, et cetera. And what I've documented and others have documented is those have actually gone down as we've become more capable using a lot of fossil fuel energy to become very resilient. Climate disaster deaths are down globally 98% in the last century. So this is I'm just compounding the question. How is it that they have uh, credibility? I think part of it is that some of their core ideas haven't been challenged. So with the environmental predictions, it's what I call the delicate nurture review of nature. So the view that nature exists in a delicate nurturing balance that human impact ruins. So our impact is just an earth destroying force. This is not at all true. The earth without us is not some delicate nurturing paradise. It's very dynamic, it changes all the time. It's deficient, it doesn't give us a lot of resources, and it's dangerous. And we need to impact it a lot productively to make it feel stable and to make it an abundant and safe place. So sometimes it's an unchecked assumption. I think with the energy stuff, a lot of it has been idealism, that the anti-fossil fuel movement has had an ideal in terms of, hey, we want to be net zero, we want to be against fossil fuels, we want a green planet. And the other side historically hasn't had an ideal. And so often, when one side has an ideal and also a plan to get there, even if it's a terrible plan that leads to terrible consequences, people still want to follow some ideal with some plan. And part of my work is saying, no, let's have a different ideal. Let's rid of this ideal of not impacting the planet, not impacting the climate. Let's have this ideal of global human flourishing. And the way we achieve that is through human freedom, including energy freedom. And a big part of that is a fossil future. So a world where fossil fuels continue to make the world a more abundant, safe, and enjoyable place.
A huge part of the debate, obviously, is that narrative that solar and wind are rapidly replacing fossil fuels in supplying the energy we need. And you write about that in a fascinating way with fascinating facts in Fossil Future. So, is that true, what we are being told there? Is solar and wind energy rapidly replacing fossil fuels in our world today? Is it true?
No, and I'll give you some facts, but then also there's a website I put together called energytalkingpoints.com that you can just search for solar and wind and you'll see all these facts, plus many more. Maybe at some point we'll have it available in German. I think some people are actually, if anyone, by the way, if anyone wants to translate my stuff, like that's online on Energy Talking Points, you can do it free of charge. So no obstacles to anybody getting this information. So yeah, what we hear is, so the first, you kind of hear some layers of lies, basically. So the first layer is, well, solar and wind are rapidly replacing fossil fuels in an energy transition. And then you find out, well, fossil fuel use, despite all the hostility and despite so much competition over the years, is still growing. So you can't have an energy transition away from something that's still growing. So any solar and wind is an energy addition. Then the next thing is, okay, well, we're rapidly going to see the decline of fossil fuels because countries know that solar and wind are actually cheaper. We see that. But then you look at, well, what countries actually care about cheap energy? I'd say number one, everyone would agree almost, would be China. What's China doing? They have 300 new coal plants in the pipeline. A lot of that is being used to make new solar and wind components and infrastructure. So why are they using coal if solar and wind are actually cheaper? Why don't they use just more solar and wind to make the solar and wind? And so there's clearly something wrong. And then finally you'll hear, well, solar and wind, they're not growing fast on an absolute basis. So they're not really outgrowing fossil fuels, but they're growing on a relative basis. So they're growing faster relative to their own size. And that's definitely true. But if you see what's happening, the dynamics that are causing them to grow are overwhelmingly political. So they're getting huge subsidies. They're getting mandates. I mean, look at Germany's policy. It's not a free market. It's trying to force people to use this. And one thing that's very underrated is, on the grid, they have no price penalty on most grids for unreliability. So they get to sell unreliable electricity for the same price as reliable, and that's considered fair. Well, that's a huge advantage. I mean, imagine you were allowed to sell rental cars and they didn't have to work 2/3 of the time. That would not be a fair that would not be a fair market. And so the basic reason, so they're not actually replacing fossil fuels in an energy transition. If you want to look at the reasons why, I mean, they're kind of two categories. One is they're just providing electricity, which right now is 1/5 of the world's energy. So most of the energy we use is directly burning fossil fuels, either for transportation or for heat. In the case of transportation, it's usually it's at least often because there's no real substitute with electricity. So with smaller vehicles, you can to some extent, not with airplanes and cargo ships and this kind of thing. But so And then with industrial heat and some residential heat, it's often the cheapest thing to do is to directly burn fossil fuels rather than use electricity. So one is, they're not even doing the same thing as fossil fuels in most cases. And then the second thing is, even in the realm of electricity, they're not cheaper if you factor in the full cost. People who say they're cheaper, what they're doing is they're only looking at the cost of producing unreliable electricity. So they just look at the cost of the panels or the wind turbines, but nobody wants unreliable electricity. What you need to look at is the full cost of turning all of your inputs, including unreliable inputs, into reliable. And that's the dynamic I mentioned earlier about, well, you need to look at the cost of the solar panels and wind turbines, but also the entire backup or life support infrastructure to support them. So that includes batteries don't really scale well. So it's a little bit of batteries, but it's usually actually fossil fuel plants that are backing them up. This is what you saw with Germany and the coal plant. So when you look at the full cost, they're not even very good for electricity, let alone all of energy. And that's why they're not actually replacing fossil fuels, but they are causing huge problems. So if they were actually cheaper and better, why do we suddenly have all these problems that we didn't have before?
I mean, you have studied this intensively, and you've mentioned Germany being an industrial country, and German wealth originating from us being an industrial country. What is your estimate? Can wind and solar power a country of steel mills and heavy industry in the future? Will that be is that physically possible?
It's hard to say things are physically possible or not. I don't see evidence that it's going to. I mean, the most I think the most charitable thing would be for some economies, they could be a significant portion. I mean, for many reasons, I don't think Germany's ideal, particularly in solar. It's not like Germany has the greatest solar resources ever, which is another sign that this is done for non-economic reasons. So I don't like to, as a commentator, physically rule things out, but I will say that they have to solve some major, major problems if this is going to happen. And the main thing is this intermittency problem. So how do you deal with the fact that this is only available a certain amount of the time? It's never available in exactly the amount you need it. And it can really go near zero, including sometimes for extended periods of time, as you see. I forget what you call it in Germany, but sort of the dark and still periods that people have. So I would just say that what you want to figure out a way for these things to actually compete on the merits. And one idea I have that I'm working on in US politics is, well, what if you required everyone on the grid to generate reliable electricity and they can do it however they want? So if they have a great scheme to use solar and batteries, great. But you require every generating group to actually deliver reliable electricity instead of allowing the solar and wind to deliver unreliable, and then everyone else has to pay for it.
That is the big point here in Germany. We are subsidizing unreliable energy
Yeah, yeah.
with billions of euros each year. By now, it has become crazy in Germany. Not sure if you're following this. The government, under old contracts of subsidizing this economy, is now paying billions for energy, for solar and wind energy, during times where the value of this energy is zero. But there are still contracts in place that say the government has to purchase this energy, so it's around 14 to 15 billion a year now for energy that is literally worth zero. So it's a fascinating market. Another question, Alex, we're being told that the world, and this is a major argument for turning away from fossil, we are being told that the world is becoming more dangerous by using fossil fuels, that our lives are in danger, lives of our kids are in danger, natural disasters will happen more, will kill more people. Is that true?
Yeah, so I mean, we have ways of measuring this stuff. So it's interesting. And you never hear them referenced, or you're starting to hear them, I think, in part because of me and some other people. But we actually can document, hey, how many people are dying from storms? How many people are dying from floods? And everyone thinks it's getting greater. But if you think common sense, really, would you rather live in today's world or the world of 1924 in terms of climate disasters, or 1824? And if you think about it that way, you think, wait a second, whatever has changed in the climate itself is probably pretty minor compared to our ability to keep ourselves safe from climate. And the data bear that out. So they show, I mentioned before, a 98% decline in disaster deaths that are climate related, so storms and floods and wildfires, temperature extremes, etc. And what even surprises people more is fossil fuels are a huge portion of this because they power all of the infrastructure that allows us to stay safe. So the biggest example, you can think of heating and cooling, which people undervalue that. That's a huge one, particularly heating, because most of the world is too cold for people. We have far more people dying of cold than from heat, which people don't realize when they're afraid of warming, but that's true. But maybe the most dramatic is drought. So historically, drought was the biggest killer. Fossil fuels have powered irrigation systems and they've powered crop transport, so we can move crops from one place to another place to alleviate the consequences of drought. And we now have 99% decline in drought related deaths over the past 100 years. It's the leading way in which we've reduced climate related disaster deaths. And yet nobody talks about it. So everyone is afraid, oh, fossil fuels are, if there's a drought, like in California, now at the moment, we've been having huge amounts of rain. But whenever there's a drought, it's always, oh, fossil fuels ruined California. They're going to cause drought. We're all going to die. But if you look at the stats, we're all living because we're so resilient to drought, in large part because of fossil fuels, versus when we had real droughts in the past, including, by the way, here, bigger droughts. We didn't have the energy and we couldn't handle it. So we're so much better off climate wise if you factor in what I call our climate mastery ability, our ability to neutralize climate danger and maximize climate benefits. And so we should just wake up and realize, look, we're in the 21st century. We're good at dealing with climate. We shouldn't be worried about climate changes all that much. We should be worried about being free and productive and powerful by using a lot of energy. That should be the priority. And unfortunately, it's not the priority in Germany, and it's not the priority in much of the world.
So true, so true. To everything you just said, you're also making a fascinating point in your book. You're saying politicians, journalists, scientists all over the world are overemphasizing the side effects of fossil fuels while ignoring the massive benefits. Please explain that to us.
Sure. So if you think about any product or technology, so let's say you're thinking about an antibiotic, should I use this antibiotic or not? I think everyone would agree, well, you need to carefully look at both the benefits, so what are going to be the beneficial effects of using it, and then the side effects. What are going to be the other effects that you weren't really your purpose, but you get them as part of it. You have this with an antibiotic, and there's actually such a thing as positive side effects. You need to be open to that. But the main thing with side effects is you're concerned with negative side effects. The interesting thing with fossil fuels is when we talk about climate change as the only issue with fossil fuels, or that's what we're focused on. What we're doing is we're just looking at potential negative side effects, and we're not looking at benefits. But this is a catastrophic error in any field. It's particularly bad in fossil fuels because, as I mentioned, fossil fuels, part of their benefits is that they can neutralize climate danger. So, if an increase in climate danger, or at least climate challenges, is part of the side effect of fossil fuels, but the benefit is to neutralize climate danger, then fossil fuels can actually cure their own side effects. And that's a very special thing. Not many technologies can cure their own side effects, but this is why we have dramatic increases in fossil fuel use. Everything is getting better in terms of food, water availability, technology, everything that energy powers. But also, we're safer than ever from climate because whatever side effects fossil fuels have had climate wise that are negative, there are some positive as well, but whatever there's been that's negative, they've been overwhelmed by the benefits, by what I call the climate mastery benefits of using fossil fuels. And so, what you have is because our whole, I call it our knowledge system. So, the institutions and people we rely on for expert knowledge and guidance, because they are so thinking of fossil fuels in a biased way, they're not looking at the benefits. They're blind to the fact that fossil fuels are making the world better, including safer from climate. They think it's making the world worse and more endangered from climate. And then they think, we can just get rid of fossil fuels and all our problems will be solved. And it's like, no, fossil fuels solved all of these problems that will then reemerge, like starvation, climate danger, etc., if you remove them.
We'll get to the knowledge system in a moment because it's also fascinating. But another point you're making in Fossil Future is that the ideology of abandoning fossil fuels will have, and I quote here, blood on their hands. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think you already see this in Europe. I mean, you see this all over the place. You really have to think of energy as just the most important thing in the sense of this is what allows us to use machines to escape manual labor, to be productive, to be prosperous, and ultimately to live much longer lives. So if you think about taking away energy, let's just look in the realm of agriculture. We have this whole practice of we ignore the benefits of fossil fuels for food and we pretend, oh, if we only get rid of fossil fuels, then we'll avoid global warming, then we'll have plenty of food. No, you cannot even feed 1 billion people on this planet without modern agriculture, let alone 8 billion. And we totally depend on fossil fuels for our agricultural fuel, like for all the machines that allow us to do a lot of work. And natural gas is the basis of modern fertilizer. And so anyone who's reducing the availability of fossil fuels, let alone trying to eliminate it, they are making food more expensive. They're making people starve, and they're also making food trade off against other values. So we've seen even in Europe, people. I mean, I talk about in the U.S. This popular show Game of Thrones, where everyone is afraid of winter, and it's like they say winter is coming, but it's a medieval show. But now Europe is afraid of winter. Like, how can you be afraid of winter in the modern world? But the reason people are afraid of winter is because they can actually die. So you see in England, like people, probably in Germany too, but definitely England, people like huddling in buses all day just so they can be warm, or going to public libraries so they can be warm, and not being able to pay both their heating bill and their food and their water bill. These are all consequences of expensive energy. And so absolutely the people who do that have blood on their hands. Never mind what you're doing I mean, that's even small compared to what you're doing to the undeveloped world, which is unable to develop, as long as you have this anti-fossil fuel movement pressuring everyone against fossil fuels.
That is something that always fascinates me because obviously the whole climate movement is a movement in Germany by the Green Party that is always very concerned about the global south and equal rights for everyone and bringing up those countries. And I always wonder, how do we tell these countries, after we've gotten rich and wealthy and healthy on fossil fuels, how do we tell billions of people in the world, no, 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 you can't, you cannot create and cheap energy for your children, for keeping your children warm. You cannot start modern agriculture and have a glass of milk every day or meat. You can't do that because we're abandoning fossil fuels. Isn't that insanely racist?
It's at least very unjust. There's a question of what the motive is, and I think it varies among people. I will say though that I am not an expert in the German Green Party at all, but in general, the alleged concern for poor people with the climate movement, I consider a fraud. So what you'll hear is their sole concern with poor people in the world is they'll say, they're the worst victims of climate change. So climate change will hurt the poor most of all. And insofar as there's any negative to climate change, yeah, obviously, everything hurts the poor most of all because they're not resilient. They're not as productive. They're not as prosperous. That's the way it works. But the solution is for people to become resilient, productive, and prosperous. And what you're doing is you're depriving them of an essential tool of that, which is energy, because fossil fuels we need for most of the world to get energy. So it's totally phony to say, for example, you'll see, I mean, people were talking about, Afghanistan's having a bad harvest or something like that. And they'll say, this is why we need to get rid of fossil fuels. Really? Or maybe they need to industrialize agriculture. Because guess what? In the United States, we're not having famines, whatever the climate is, because we have modern industrial fossil fueled agriculture. So it's just a total fraud to claim they just cherry pick harms to the poor that allow them to justify their agenda that will ruin the poor. It's not a real concern. If you're really concerned about somebody, you cannot say, hey, let's get rid of our number one form of energy in a world that needs far more energy.
You've mentioned the knowledge system. Uh, Most Germans are not familiar with that term. To me, it feels they play a very, very important role in shaping this debate. And my observation is it has become so difficult, sometimes dangerous, to take an alternate view in the climate debate, in the fossil fuels debate. Why is that? Why has it become so dangerous to, have a different view? And what role does the knowledge system play in this?
So knowledge system is a term I actually came up with because I was trying to capture something that I didn't find captured with any existing term. So we'll often talk about the media being biased, right? And people are somewhat familiar with this. A newspaper will only tell you one side of the story, they won't tell you the other side of the story. But what I noticed is this doesn't capture other kinds of distortion of knowledge or attempts at knowledge, because you can also have distortions of knowledge when people are doing research. For example, you can have funding only going to one school of thought versus another school of thought. That can very much distort what happens. So, one thing I talk about in Fossil Future is there's very little funding to study, say, the benefits, the plant growth benefits of CO2. That's just not an interesting thing to a lot of the leaders, particularly political leaders, even though that is a very, very significant phenomenon that I believe deserves more study. So you can have a distortion in research. You can also have a distortion in how research gets synthesized. So there's so much research in the world. Ultimately, it needs to get synthesized, so it's remotely accessible to us. The people doing the synthesis, there's a lot of room for error there. There's a lot of kinds of biases that exist, and I am very critical of what's called the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the leading climate synthesis organization. But it commits this very basic error of it only looks at negative side effects of fossil fuels and not benefits. And as part of that, it totally denies that fossil fuels have made us safer from climate. It doesn't deny that by denying it explicitly, it just doesn't mention it. It leaves out the fact that we're safer than ever from climate. But a climate synthesis report can't leave that out. That's insane. So you can see that. Then there's what I call errors of dissemination, and that's more the media. So the people who are supposed to take the synthesis from the different scientific and research communities and communicate it to us, that can get distorted in all sorts of ways. And then the final distortion is what I call possible distortion, is what I call distortion of evaluation. So once we have certain received knowledge, how do we put it all together? And again, we have this problem of people are only looking at negative side effects of fossil fuels, but not benefits. And so I call this system of research, synthesis, dissemination, evaluation, I call this our knowledge system. And it's really important to know how it works because we need it to work well, but we also need to be aware that it can malfunction. And I think you both need to appreciate its functions, but also realize they can malfunction. And I think the criticism of it, or the fear of it, is, there's a lot of people within that system who are very defensive and who just want to be authorities and don't want to be questioned. That's a misreading of the functions of the system. The functions of knowledge systems, particularly when you're dealing with specialized knowledge, is you do your best to communicate your particular sliver area, but then you're encouraging other people to put together the knowledge in different ways, to think critically, particularly about this issue of evaluation. I was reading a really good constitutional scholar in the US the other day, and he had a good line, which he said, expert knowledge is not the same as expert decision making. So often the best decision making comes from consulting a lot of different experts. But if one little sliver of experts thinks, hey, we get to dictate the whole global economy because we know a lot about climate, that's a disaster. That's like saying we get to dictate the whole global economy because we know a lot about COVID-19. Well, even if you do know a lot about COVID-19, that doesn't mean that you should control every aspect of life, including many aspects that you no doubt don't understand and or don't appreciate.
So true, so true. So Alex, many people, have heard so much from the knowledge system. They have taken in all this information, and they have the feeling, okay, I'm being told, I'm being fed one narrative, one story about climate change, how we have to abandon everything I knew in my life, all the fossil fuels I've grown up with, this, our countries got rich with, but they're intimidated. They are scared to say that they may have doubts about this narrative because they have seen the reaction from the media on social media. And I guess you have a lot of experience with that, with, confronting or being confronted with people who say, well, you have the wrong view. What is your advice to people who just have doubts about what they're being told every day in the media, same narrative, and they want to express themselves, but they are scared, like where to go to, where to look for facts, how to make their argument?
Well, I think it's very helpful to distinguish in people's minds. You can think of it as doubts about the mainstream framework, and then doubts about the mainstream facts. And I talk a lot about framework in Fossil Future, but the basic thing is one aspect of that to focus on here is just thinking methods. Do you think people are thinking about this issue in the right way? So if you notice, hey, wait, people aren't talking about any benefits of fossil fuels, they're only talking about negative side effects, that can be a very good thing to raise that often people will be open to, because you're not saying, hey, every scientist is wrong or all the scientists are wrong. You're saying, I don't think people are thinking about this issue the right way. And that's often where I start, is getting clear on, hey, why don't we think about this in an even-handed way? Let's carefully weigh benefits and side effects. Or another kind of framework issue is, why are we assuming that the climate is this delicate, nurturing thing? That's clearly not true. It's changed all the time. It's always been really inhospitable if we don't have a lot of productive ability. Why are we treating it this way? Or you might even say, why is our goal? Another issue is goal. Why is our goal as a world to eliminate our climate impact? That's what net zero means. Why is that our top goal as a world? Even if that is a goal, why is that the goal that we're sacrificing everything else to? Does that make any sense? So these are what I call framework questions. And those are ultimately the most important. You're questioning the starting points that people are operating from. And often when people are trying to dictate to you, they can't defend their framework, but they just want to pretend that they just want you to accept their framework because they allegedly have factual expertise. So they say, I'm a climate scientist, you listen to me, you do what I say. But wait a second, I might not agree with your framework, even if you're right about the facts. So I would say that's really good on framework. And then on facts, I would say you need to find a really reliable source of facts. And that can be really hard. So that's why I've created one. I have a website, energytalkingpoints.com, that's totally free to everybody. And you can see thousands of facts on that website, and they're all referenced and they're all concise. And you can use them. And you should look into what I say and what others say, and you can see what is our actual credibility. How many times has anyone actually refuted me? It's very, very few, despite thousands and thousands of claims and all these people against me. So I would say check that out. And then from that, you'll also learn about primary sources, because you really ultimately want to get your facts from good sources. I will say there are plenty of people who are in my general vicinity who there's lots of stuff on Twitter that I don't think is true that supposedly agrees with me. So you have to be careful about this stuff. But I will say I try to be a very good source of that. So it's the framework, like questioning the framework and then questioning the facts. And sometimes it's, facts they don't know, like the fact about the decline in climate disaster deaths. No one was contradicting that. They just didn't know it. You know what happened is New York Times tried to go after it, Reuters tried to go after it, PolitiFact, which is a thing in the US, tried to go after it, and none of them could actually refute it. None of them could refute it. They tried to claim, oh, it doesn't really matter. We still have a climate emergency, even though we've had a decline in climate disaster deaths. But that's an example of often you can learn facts that people just don't know, or even that we're having an energy addition. Nobody can dispute that, but you'll never hear it. So you can both get refutations of the prevailing alleged facts, but you can also get new facts that the existing framework and narrative would never tell you. And again, energytalkingpoints.com, we have all of that, and then Fossil Future puts it all together.
And it's okay to question the facts, although sometimes the science tells us not to question the facts.
Yes, yes, but I would say there's sometimes a tendency for people to be anti-expert, which I think is dangerous. So you want to be anti-authority in the sense of somebody is telling you what to do or telling you that like you can't question anything. But what you don't want to do is assume, oh, if somebody who studied this for their whole life says something, it must be BS, and so I'm just going to listen to this guy who happens to be in my political party. I wouldn't say that. So you want to have a respect for expertise, but you don't treat experts as authorities. You treat them as advisors. But so questioning, but that doesn't mean just coming up with random questions. I mean, in the United States, this might offend some people, but we had a Super Bowl recently, which is our big football event, and the international pop star Taylor Swift is the girlfriend of one of the players, and there was a bunch of people in the U.S. saying, "Hey, I think there's a conspiracy. Like this is a conspiracy," and there's no evidence for this at all. But they're like, "I'm just asking questions. I'm just questioning the narrative. What's wrong?" Like, no, you have to actually have some evidence. You just don't get to make things up.
So true. Such a brilliant point. Alex, last question. German energy prices have soared. We've abandoned nuclear power here. We're trying to run a country of, industry, steel mills on wind and solar. It seems crazy. Is there any hope? What should a sane German government do when it comes to energy policies of the future and fossil fuel? A sane German government, what should they do?
Well, I think any government should ultimately adopt what I call energy freedom policies. And again, at energytalkingpoints.com, we have a lot of detail about this. I'm working with a lot of US politicians on it. But it's basically the idea that, hey, we want to be open to all forms of energy production and energy use. And that's going to be the way that you get the best electricity, the best industrial heat, the best residential heat, the best mobility is by competition, by discovery, just like anything else. And also, this is the only way you're actually going to get lower emission sources of energy, because the only way to get lower emissions globally is if it's actually cost competitive. So for Germany to wreck its own economy and hurt its security, or for America to do that, that doesn't accomplish very much. China's still on any axis, because China's still going to, they're building 300 new coal plants designed to last 40 years each, as long as that's the most cost effective. So if you're actually interested in emissions reduction, the number one thing you can do is innovate something that's actually better. But to ignore the fact that we don't yet have those innovations and just foist the inferior stuff, Germany has really taken a beating with its willingness to adopt inferior technology in energy. And I think it should learn, and we should all learn. So I'm not an expert on persuading the people, but I would say that at least they should know the facts about energy. They should know the facts about climate, and they need to get rid of this idea that we're in a climate crisis and the world is going to end. No, the world is getting better. The world is only going to end if it has no energy and no freedom.
Alex Epstein, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. Buy his book, buy Alex Epstein's book, Fossil Future. It's a great book. It's very thoughtful, and it's many things in there that you don't hear every day in the media. Alex, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you.